Hi guys. She told my Mountain Dew. Well, I'm not gonna open it yet. Alright. Let's do... Let's do... The serial killer nobody talks about real-life Candyman.
August 8th, 1973, 8:24 a.m., Houston, Texas. An emergency telephone operator named Velma Lines picks up a call. She hears what sounds like a young man say, "Y'all better come here right now. I just killed a man." Not long after, cops arrive at 2020 Lamar Drive. There they find the body of Dean Corll, a well-respected man known for once being the vice president of the much-loved Corll Candy Company. What police don't know is that this man lying dead on the floor will become known as one of the most depraved and prolific serial killers in history. He is the thing of nightmares, a real-life boogeyman whose crimes were so sick they were beyond sadistic. That young man who made the call and did indeed pull the trigger was 17-year-old Elmer Wayne Henley, the poor kid who'd spent much of his youth huffing solvents and getting into trouble. He'd had a wretched existence, but he never knew dark until he met the guy everyone in the neighborhood affectionately called the Candyman. Henley, still shaken, told the police he'd killed Corll because of what had been happening over the last few years, something he played a big part in himself. That was to lure mostly disenfranchised teens into Corll's lair. Henley showed police what Corll called his torture board, an 8 by 2 foot piece of plywood, which victims were held to by hooks. He showed them a set of tools, part of Corll's abominable and well-stocked torture kit. The police couldn't believe it when this young man described in lurid detail what Corll would do to his victims, sometimes for days, before they were eventually slaughtered on the board. The cops certainly thought the kid was a nut when he told them there had been dozens of victims tortured and killed by the dead maniac lying on the floor. That would make him the worst serial killer ever. Henley wasn't lying, but he hadn't even gotten started. Before we get to the absolute horrors that happened at the hands of Corll, let's rewind a bit. Dean Corll was a kid with health problems, and so he wasn't exactly the sociable kind, but he found his footing as a teenager when he started working with his mother and her second husband making candies. He just loved tinkering around with the candy-making machines, watching those colorful sugary balls of goodness come out the other end. His mother later spread her wings when she opened the Corll Candy Company in Houston Heights. She made Dean, then just in his early 20s, the vice president. In those days, what was called just the Heights was a rundown area populated by mostly poor white families. Kids ran around in the streets causing trouble, some of them literally with no place to go. In short, it wasn't far from being a slum. That's one reason why young folks loved to hang out at the Candy Company. It was a bit of color among the drab buildings. It provided them with just a little bit of happiness. Every day, almost on the dot, Corll would come out, his hands filled with broken candies that couldn't be sold. He'd give them to the waiting kids who stood there, grinning with outstretched hands. Corll was loved for this act of kindness by the kids and their parents. Things were not as they seemed, though. Psychologically, Dean Corll had issues. He'd always been a loner and never had any real friends. It didn't make matters easier for him that he was struggling with his homosexuality, something he kept hidden due to the rampant homophobia back then. It wasn't until he was drafted into the U.S. Army in 1964 that he really was sure about his sexuality. It was during this short stint in the Army that he had his first intimate experience with a man. Still, when he returned to the Candy Company, he was not open about how he felt. People around him remarked how he flirted with young guys in the factory, and they noticed how animated he became when young guys would turn up to take the free candies he offered every day. They followed him around as if he was some kind of savior. Hence, he got another nickname, the Pied Piper. What the adults didn't know is that, like the tale of the Pied Piper, which has a much darker version, Dean Corll had something terrible growing inside him. He was going to do the unspeakable, and he was in the ideal place to do it.
Oh my god, I'm gonna try to find my baby. Okay, I'm back, guys. headbutting.
That's because the Heights neighborhood was renowned for being home to what some people called white trash. And this was in a city that in the 50s was called Murder City because it was so violent. If you wanted to make people go missing in Houston Heights back then, let's just say that another petty criminal vanishing off the streets didn't exactly mean a lot to the police. The time was ripe for Coral, who knew very well that cops took little notice when a kid known for petty theft and inhaling paint thinners went missing. These kinds of kids were to be Coral's prey, and there were plenty of them around. At first, he just hung out with them. He installed a pool table at the candy company where they could play. He was surrounded by these young street urchins almost every evening after work. He didn't complain when they drank booze or smoked weed. To onlookers, the vice president was harmless. He was always well-dressed, well-spoken, and even though quiet, he was friendly enough. He was also wealthy, and plenty of cash in your pocket can often give a person immunity to scrutiny. This is what the mother of one of the murdered kids said about him. He was crazy about children. He let them walk all over him. He worked awfully hard. He was like a man that had nothing on his mind but success. It was when the factory closed that things turned bad. According to serial killer author Peter Vronsky in his book American Serial Killers, that was when Coral went out in search of victims. Because young men in the neighborhood had grown up taking sweets from the Candyman, they'd all trusted him implicitly. So when Coral drove around in his car or his white van and after pulling over said, "Get in, I have booze and weed," people did just that. At his house, he'd throw crazy parties. Young folks were handed all the booze and drugs they wanted and music blared for hours on end. Except someone would always pass out. It was then when they woke up hanging by hooks on the torture board, with Coral standing next to them holding something from his torture kit. We'd be demonetized if we described what he did to some of his victims' bodies. And to be honest, it's just too sick to describe. Let's just say Dean Coral might have read the Marquis de Sade. That's where the word sadist comes from, if you didn't already know. After he'd had his fun, which could take days, he would strangle or shoot them and then bury them under boat storage that he was paying rent for, or in some remote area near the beach. Other times he'd torture his victims in the van itself. He'd fitted it out to be soundproof so no one could hear the screams of his victims. He didn't have his board in the van, but he did have steel hooks attached to the inside. Some of the victims used to work at the candy company, so they may not have thought twice about going back to his house of horrors or getting in the van. But many of the victims ended up there because of the guy we mentioned, Elmer Wayne Henley, along with another teen, David Owen Brooks. They told other guys in the street that free booze and weed were to be had if they wanted it. In a statement to police, Henley later said he was paid $200 from Coral for every victim, but he did not stay around for the torture at first. What he saw was Coral handcuff the kid and then gag him. When the victim was taken to the back room, Henley was dismissed. At first, Henley said he wasn't sure if the victims were killed, but later he certainly knew because he sometimes helped bury the bodies. Brooks also later testified, saying one time he saw Henley take part in one of the murders, and he knew exactly what happened on the torture board. What's even worse, some of the victims were Henley and Brooks's friends. Henley said he thought he was trapped and he was scared something bad might happen to him. He told investigators that he tried to join the Navy, but it didn't work out. He also said this, "I couldn't go anyway. If I wasn't around, I knew Dean would go after one of my little brothers, who he always liked a little too much." When Coral moved to 2020 Lamar Drive, the frequency in which he asked Brooks and Henley for new boys increased, as did the brutality of the torture. You'd think someone would have said something, or at least pointed a finger at Carol. After all, it was clear he only hung out with teen boys, and it was clear teen boys kept going missing. Such is the power of money and a nice suit. Coral was still admired in the neighborhood. Who could say anything bad about the Candyman? Now we'll introduce Rhonda Williams to the story. She was an attractive teenager who was engaged to an 18-year-old named Frank Aguirre. He was not into crime or drinking like some other kids and held down a good job. And then one day, he just went missing. Williams looked high and low for him, and he never turned up. Then one day, her cool neighbor, a guy named Wayne Henley, informed her that Frank had been murdered by the mafia. Of course, Henley had delivered Frank to court, like all those other boys whose faces were now on missing persons posters all over the place. Williams and Henley became friends, often smoking weed and downing beers while talking about the tough lives they lived. One thing they didn't talk about, though, was Henley's dark secret. One day, they were out on their bicycles when she got a flat tire. As they stood there in the street, a white van pulled up alongside them. The friendly driver was the Candyman, whom Williams had heard of. But she didn't have a clue Henley supplied him with various torture victims. In a cordial tone, Coral said, "Put your bikes in the back of the van and I'll take you home." They did just that, with Williams wondering why the van looked like some kind of cage. But in the end, Coral actually did do what he said he'd do, and Williams arrived home safely. He had no interest in girls. A few weeks later, and the date was August 7th, In the evening that day, Williams had a huge fight with her hot-tempered father. She was so scared she had to bolt the door to her room where she was hiding from him. Her neighbor Henley turned up to help. In tow, he had 17-year-old Tim Curley, who Williams had never met. Williams told them that she had to get away from the house or else her father might do something crazy. So Henley told her that he knew of a place where they could all go and everything would be all right. Things were about to get very, very weird. At least for two people in this threesome. When they got to Coral's house, things weren't all right at all. With a room door closed so the other two kids couldn't hear, Coral shouted at Henley, "You've ruined everything by bringing that girl." What he meant was he had $200 ready to pay Henley for his next victim, the unassuming Curley. How could Coral do his wicked business with the girl there? Henley told him about the violent father, after which Coral seemed to calm down a bit. He grabbed some weed and put it down on the table in front of the teens. Then he came back from the kitchen with a tin of solvent and 3 rags and said it was time to have what he called a huffing party. The next thing Henley knew, he was waking from a state of unconsciousness with his hands handcuffed behind him. The other two were tied up and gagged. Obviously, they had no idea what happened, but Henley knew exactly how things were going to turn out, maybe for all 3 of them. He saw himself losing his manhood on the torture board while the creepiest man in the world breathed obscenities into his ear. Coral then put a .22 into Henley's stomach and again shouted, "You ruined everything." The other 2 teens nervously laughed under their gags, thinking this was some kind of outrageous prank. With the gun at Henley's head now, Coral said he would have the boy, but for ruining things, Henley had to torture and kill the girl. Henley nodded his head and Coral removed the cuffs. The other 2 still thought it was some kind of game. Williams and Curley only started to understand the gravity of the situation when Coral removed all his clothes. He proceeded to walk over to the now wriggling body of Curley. At that moment, Williams' gag came loose, and still kind of smiling, she whispered to Henley, "Is this for real?" She looked for cracks at the side of his mouth when he said in a deadly serious voice, "Yes, this is for real." Henley shouted over to Coral just as he was beginning his cycle of depravity and said, "Hey Dean, why don't you let me take the chick out of here? She don't want to see that." Coral just carried on. Henley, seeing an opportunity, leaped to the side and picked up the gun. He pointed it at Coral and shouted, "Back off! Stop!" Coral, thinking Henley was his ever-obedient helper, returned the threat with, "Go ahead, shoot. You won't do it." Bang, 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 bang. With 6 bullets in him, Coral tried to move but collapsed dead in the hallway. His bloodied, stark-naked body slumped against the wall. Henley then made the call. "Y'all better come here right now. I just killed a man." After he'd untied Williams and Curley, he told them the truth, showing them the torture tools, the bore, even admitting that if Curley had been killed, he would have gotten $200. When the cops came, Henley was read his Miranda rights, to which he shouted back in the cop's face, "I don't care who knows about it, I have to get it off my chest." 27 bodies were found in all, many showing the marks of the days of the obscene torture they'd endured before they died. There was likely at least another victim too, even though movies and documentaries seem to mostly ignore Dean Coral. At the time, this body count made him the worst U.S. serial killer in history. Even now, he's virtually unheard of, which is strange when you consider the plethora of movies and documentaries about less demented and less prolific killers. Henley is still in prison today, not for killing Coral, but for everything else he did. The prosecutor said the crimes were the most extreme example of man's inhumanity to man I've ever seen. Henley might get out of jail in 2025, and if he does, he'll be 65. Brooks died in 2020 while still in prison. Curley and Williams naturally never got over the trauma of that day. Curley had mental issues throughout his life and was an alcoholic for most of it. In 2008, he died from a heart attack. Williams was equally traumatized, but she didn't fall prey to alcoholism. She said all her life after the incident, she wasn't sure how she felt about Henley. On one hand, he had led teens toward perhaps the most horrific death possible, and on the other hand, he had saved her life. In 2005, she turned up to the prison where Henley was incarcerated and decided to try and understand just how bad he was. He told her in no uncertain terms that on that day he'd almost shot her instead of Coral, and so saved himself from police capture. He would no doubt have also got $200 for doing it. That was all she needed to know. She walked out of the prison gates and told herself this dark chapter in her life was over.
Alright guys, I will see you in my third video, so I see you then.